Alright, let's get into it. Number 10. Leprosy. In medieval Europe, a diagnosis of leprosy was legally equivalent to death. Sufferers were forced to attend their own funeral mass, declared civilly dead by the church, and expelled from society, sometimes handed a wooden clapper and a hooded cloak, and told never to touch another human being again. The disease that inspired this ritual burial of the living is still infecting people today. At its peak, an estimated 19,000 leprosaria, dedicated leper colonies, operated across Europe alone. The bacterium responsible, Mycobacterium leprae, was not identified until 1873, when Norwegian physician Gerhard R. Maurer Hansen finally gave the disease a scientific name rather than a theological one. For centuries before that, it was understood purely as divine punishment, a visible mark of spiritual corruption made flesh. What leprosy actually does is insidious and slow. It attacks the peripheral nervous system, destroying sensation in the extremities over months and years. Fingers and toes are not lost to the disease directly. They are lost because the patient can no longer feel them being damaged. The disfigurement that made medieval societies recoil in horror is the quiet, accumulated consequence of a body that has lost the ability to protect itself. The World Health Organization recorded 174,087 new leprosy cases in 2022, spread across 120 countries. India, Brazil, and Indonesia account for roughly 80% of global infections. In 2015, the CDC confirmed a cluster of cases in Florida with no travel history and no known exposure. The source was wild armadillos, which carry and transmit Mycobacterium leprae and have been doing so silently across the American South for decades. A disease that medieval society considered God's most visible punishment is still finding new hosts in the 21st century, in new species, in new continents. That is not a medieval problem, that is ours. Number 9. Typhus. When Napoleon's Grand Army retreated from Moscow in the winter of 1812, it was not Russian forces that destroyed them. More French soldiers died of typhus during that campaign than were killed in combat across the entire Russian invasion. The bacterium that helped end Napoleon's ambitions is still circulating in human populations today, and the conditions it requires are never far away. Typhus is caused by a Rickettsia prowazekii, a bacterium transmitted through the faeces of infected body lice, specifically Pediculus humanus corporis, the human body louse. The name comes from the Greek word typhos, meaning smoky or hazy, a description of the delirium that overtakes the infected as fever climbs above 40 degrees Celsius, and the bacterium begins destroying the cells, lining blood vessels throughout the body. The disease carved its way through the 20th century with methodical devastation. An estimated 2 to 3 million people died of typhus during World War I in Eastern Europe alone. In 1941, a typhus epidemic tore through the Warsaw Ghetto, infecting an estimated 100,000 people in conditions of deliberate overcrowding and starvation engineered by Nazi occupation authorities. Among the dead at Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in 1945 was Margot Frank, Anne Frank's sister, killed by typhus weeks before liberation. In 1997, a typhus outbreak in Burundi infected over 100,000 people in refugee camps within months. The bacterium required nothing exotic to spread. It needed only unwashed clothing, crowded bodies, and the absence of running water. Conditions that define displacement crises everywhere. Every refugee camp, every prolonged conflict zone, every winter shelter without sanitation is an environment where typhus is patient, present, and waiting. The louse that carries it has been living in human clothing since before recorded history, and it has not run out of opportunities. Number 8. Dengue fever. Medieval chroniclers had no name for it, but the mosquito that carries dengue fever has been feeding on human blood for millennia. What they could not have anticipated is how thoroughly the modern world would help it spread. In 2023, the World Health Organization recorded over 6.5 million dengue cases globally, with more than 7,300 deaths, the worst year in recorded history for a disease that is accelerating. Dengue is caused by 4 distinct viral serotypes, designated DNV1 through DNV4, transmitted primarily by the Aedes aegypti mosquito and its adaptable cousin Aedes albopictus. Infection with one serotype generally produces a brutal but survivable illness. High fever, severe joint and muscle pain so intense it earned dengue the historical name breakbone fever, and a rash that spreads across the trunk and limbs. Most patients recover. The problem begins with a second infection. A second dengue infection with a different serotype can trigger dengue hemorrhagic fever, a condition in which the immune system's response to the virus becomes the primary threat. Blood plasma leaks from vessels, platelets collapse, and internal bleeding begins. Without treatment, mortality rates reach 20%, the body's own defenses, recognizing a familiar enemy and overreacting catastrophically, become the instrument of death. What is expanding this threat is not the virus mutating, it is the climate warming. Aedes albopictus, the tiger mosquito, has established breeding populations in southern France, Spain, Italy, and the southern United States in the past decade. Local dengue transmission has been confirmed in all of these regions. A disease that public health authorities classified as exclusively tropical 10 years ago is now producing cases in European cities with no travel history attached. When a virus that kills through your own immune system's overreaction begins establishing itself in Paris and Florida, the geography of who is at risk has permanently changed. Number 7. Cholera. In the summer of 1854, a London physician named John Snow plotted the deaths from a cholera outbreak onto a street map of Soho and found them clustering with a horrible precision around a single water pump on Broad Street. He removed the pump handle. The outbreak stopped. In that moment, Snow founded the science of epidemiology. The disease he was trying to stop is currently in the middle of its 7th global pandemic, and that pandemic began in 1961. Cholera is caused by Vibrio cholerae, a bacterium that colonizes the small intestine and produces a toxin that forces the intestinal wall to expel water and electrolytes in massive quantities. The resulting diarrhea, often described as rice water in clinical literature for its appearance, can drain a human body of 15 to 20 liters of fluid in a single day. Without treatment, the heart stops. The entire process from first symptom to death can take less than 12 hours. The mathematics of cholera's modern burden are staggering and specific. The World Health Organization estimates between 1.3 and 4 million cases annually, with 21,000 to 143,000 deaths. A range that wide existing because cholera concentrates in places where official record keeping collapses alongside infrastructure. In 2022, the WHO issued its most serious global cholera alert in decades, with simultaneous outbreaks active across 24 countries. In 2010, following the earthquake in Haiti, cholera introduced by United Nations peacekeeping forces killed nearly 10,000 people and infected over 820,000. The devastating truth of cholera is that it is not a scientific failure. Oral rehydration therapy, a mixture of water, sugar, and salt, is nearly curative if administered in time. Clean water prevents transmission entirely. We have known how to stop cholera since the 19th century. It persists because of political failure, poverty, and infrastructure collapse, a disease functioning as a real-time index of who gets protected and who does not. Cholera does not need to evolve. It just needs us to keep failing the same people in the same ways. Number 6. Syphilis. When syphilis first exploded through Europe in the 1490s, spreading city by city along the routes of soldiers returning from the Italian wars, it was so virulent and so grotesque that every nation immediately blamed another. The French called it the Neapolitan disease. The Italians called it the French disease. The English called it the French pox. Nobody wanted to own it. They all had it. Today, after a century of penicillin, the United States is recording syphilis rates not seen since before the antibiotic was discovered. Syphilis is caused by the spirochete bacterium Treponema pallidum, an organism so fragile it cannot survive outside a human host for more than minutes, yet so effective at transmission that it spread across an entire continent within a decade of its first recorded European appearance. In its early stages, it produces painless sores that disappear on their own. The infection does not disappear, it moves inward. In its tertiary stage, untreated syphilis becomes a different disease entirely, one that attacks the cardiovascular system and the central nervous system. Neurosyphilis produces psychosis, blindness, and progressive paralysis. Among those widely believed by historians to have died of its ravaging complications are the painter Edouard Manet, the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, and the gangster Al Capone, who spent his final years at his Miami estate in a state of severe cognitive deterioration after years of untreated infection. Penicillin, introduced as a syphilis treatment in 1943, was so effective that by the year 2000, CDC officials were discussing eradication as an achievable goal. Then, the numbers reversed. The CDC's 2022 Sexually Transmitted Infection Surveillance Report recorded 207,255 syphilis cases in the United States, a 74% increase over 5 years. Congenital syphilis, transmitted from mother to newborn, rose by 937% between 2012 and 2022. Globally, the World Health Organization estimates 7.1 million new infections each year. We conquered syphilis once. Then we lost that conquest. That loss is worth sitting with. Number 5. Rabies. The medieval world understood rabies as a curse. A bite from a rabid animal meant transformation. First, the sensitivity to light and sound, then the inability to swallow, the involuntary arching and writhing, the hallucinations, the desperate aggression, and finally, death, always death, with a consistency that no other disease matched. Every person bitten by a rabid animal and left untreated died. That figure has not changed. In most of the world, it still has not changed, and rabies is killing approximately 59,000 people every year. Rabies is caused by Lyssa virus, transmitted through the saliva of infected animals, most commonly domestic dogs, which are responsible for 99% of human infections worldwide. The virus travels not through the bloodstream, but along peripheral nerve fibers, moving slowly toward the brain. This is why the incubation period can last weeks or months, and why, by the time neurological symptoms appear, the outcome is already determined. The case fatality rate, once symptoms begin, is virtually 100%. Fewer than 24 human beings have survived symptomatic rabies infection in recorded history. The World Health Organization estimates 59,000 deaths annually, with most researchers acknowledging this is almost certainly an undercount given how many deaths in rural Africa and Asia go unrecorded. India alone accounts for approximately 35% of global rabies deaths, around 20,000 people per year. Children under 15 represent 40% of all victims, most bitten during ordinary play near working dogs. The cognitive dissonance at the center of rabies is almost unbearable. Post-exposure prophylaxis, the series of injections administered after a bite and before symptoms appear, is nearly 100% effective. The science is not the problem. The treatment costs between $300 and $1,500 per course, which places it beyond reach for most people in the countries where rabies kills most aggressively. A 2004 case in Wisconsin involving 15-year-old Gianna Giese, treated with induced coma under what became known as the Milwaukee Protocol, produced one of the first documented survivals of symptomatic rabies. It remains exceptional enough to be famous. Rabies does not kill because we lack the science. It kills because we have collectively decided, through the economics of global healthcare, that 59,000 deaths per year is an acceptable price for others to pay. Number 4. Smallpox. On October 26, 1977, a Somali cook named Ali Ma'o Malin developed a fever and a characteristic rash. He survived. He would become the last human being on Earth to contract naturally occurring smallpox. On May 8, 1980, the World Health Organization declared smallpox eradicated, the only human disease ever to be deliberately eliminated from nature. It was one of the greatest achievements in the history of medicine. The virus itself was not destroyed. 2 samples were kept alive, and they are still alive today. Variola major, the strain responsible for most historical smallpox deaths, killed approximately 30% of those it infected, a case fatality rate that compounded with terrifying efficiency across populations with no prior exposure. Conservative estimates place the death toll in the 20th century alone at between 300 and 500 million, more than both world wars combined. Survivors were frequently left blind or permanently scarred across their faces and bodies, the pustules of smallpox erupting across every surface of skin and even the linings of internal organs. 2 official stockpiles of live variola virus remain on Earth. One is held at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta, Georgia. The other is at the Vector Institute in Novosibirsk, Russia. Both are officially secured, officially monitored, and officially the subject of ongoing international debate about whether they should be destroyed entirely. In 2014, an FDA laboratory at its Bethesda campus discovered forgotten vials of smallpox in an unsecured storage room. The vials were labeled 1954. What makes the smallpox question particularly lethal is the immunological reality of eradication. Routine vaccinations ceased globally after 1980 because it was no longer necessary. Anyone born after approximately 1980 has never been vaccinated. That population now numbers in the billions, and they have zero immunity to a virus that killed 30% of infected people in an era when human populations were smaller and movement was slower. In 2022, the closely related orthopox virus Mpox spread to 110 countries, producing over 90,000 confirmed cases. It was not smallpox. But it was a demonstration of how quickly a pox virus can move through an unprotected world. We eradicated smallpox from the human body, and then we kept it alive in freezers on 2 sides of a geopolitical fault line, surrounded by a planet that has forgotten how to fight it. Number 3, bubonic plague. Between 1347 and 1351, the Black Death moved across Eurasia with a relentlessness that medieval people had no framework to comprehend. An estimated 75 to 200 million people died across Europe and Asia. Roughly half of Europe's entire population was erased within 4 years. Entire villages were wiped out completely. Mass graves were dug and filled and dug again. The world did not recover its pre-plague population levels for 2 centuries. The bacterium that caused this is still circulating in the wild right now, including in the American Southwest. Yersinia pestis, the organism responsible for the Black Death, causes 3 distinct forms of disease, depending on its route of infection. Bubonic plague, transmitted through the bite of infected fleas carried by rodents, produces the notorious swollen lymph nodes, or buboes, that gave the medieval disease its name. Septicemic plague spreads through the bloodstream, causing tissue to blacken and die. Pneumonic plague, transmitted person to person through respiratory droplets, attacks the lungs directly. Untreated pneumonic plague kills virtually 100% of those it infects, typically within 24 to 72 hours of symptom onset. The World Health Organization records between 1,000 and 2,000 plague cases annually. The United States averages approximately 7 human cases per year, concentrated in New Mexico, Arizona, and Colorado, where wild prairie dog colonies maintain a persistent Yersinia pestis reservoir that has never been eliminated. In 2017, a predominantly pneumonic plague outbreak in Madagascar produced over 2,300 cases and 202 deaths within months, prompting the WHO to issue an international health alert and deploy emergency response teams. What keeps Yersinia pestis alive is not human failure, it is ecological permanence. The bacterium has colonized rodent populations across Central Asia, Africa, and the Americas, and it circulates continuously through those reservoirs, regardless of what humans do in the surrounding environment. The thing separating the modern world from a new plague outbreak is effective antibiotics, specifically streptomycin, gentamicin, and doxycycline. They work. But antibiotic resistance is not a hypothetical future problem, and Yersinia pestis has been demonstrating, across decades of study, that it is an organism with considerable capacity to adapt. The Black Death was not an event that ended, it was an introduction. Yersinia pestis moved into the planet's rodent populations and has never left, patient in its reservoirs, waiting for the conditions that have always brought it back to us. Number 2. Tuberculosis. In the 19th century, they called it consumption because it seemed to consume you from within. The lungs slowly hollowed out, the patient growing thinner and paler across months and years, the persistent cough eventually producing blood. Poets romanticized it as a beautiful wasting. Artists and composers died of it in garrets across Europe. Frédéric Chopin died of it in 1849. John Keats died of it in 1821. Franz Kafka died of it in 1924. The World Health Organization's 2023 Global Tuberculosis Report recorded 10.6 million new infections in 2022 and 1.33 million deaths. Tuberculosis is the second leading infectious disease killer on Earth, and it is becoming impossible to treat. Mycobacterium tuberculosis is transmitted through the air, released when an infected person coughs, speaks, or breathes, and inhaled by those nearby. It is not dramatically contagious in the way of influenza, but it is extraordinarily patient. The bacterium can establish what is called a latent infection, settling into lung tissue and remaining dormant for years or decades, held in check by a functioning immune system. The World Health Organization estimates that approximately 1.7 billion people, roughly 1/4 of the global population, currently carry Mycobacterium tuberculosis in latent form. Most will never develop active disease. Some will, particularly when the immune system is weakened by age, malnutrition, or illness. The most alarming dimension of modern tuberculosis is not its prevalence, it is its evolution. In 2022, 410,000 people developed multi-drug resistant tuberculosis, a form of the disease that does not respond to the two primary first-line antibiotics, isoniazid and rifampicin. Beyond that lies extensively drug-resistant tuberculosis, which fails to respond to most available treatments entirely. Treating a standard tuberculosis case requires a 6-month antibiotic regimen. Treating drug-resistant tuberculosis requires up to 24 months of toxic second-line drugs with significant side effects and substantially lower cure rates. The BCG vaccine, introduced in 1921, provides reasonable protection for children but limited efficacy against pulmonary tuberculosis in adults, the form of the disease responsible for the majority of transmission and death. Tuberculosis also functions as a lethal accelerant for other diseases. HIV infection dramatically activates latent tuberculosis by suppressing the immune response that keeps the bacterium dormant. Tuberculosis remains the single leading cause of death among people living with HIV globally. The intersection of these two epidemics, tuberculosis and HIV, concentrating in the same impoverished, underserved populations, creates a compounding mortality that neither disease would produce alone. 1/4 of all living humans are currently carrying a bacterium that kills more than 1 million people every year, and that bacterium is systematically developing resistance to the drugs we use to stop it. That is not a crisis approaching. That is the situation now on this planet. Number 1, malaria. Malaria has been killing humans for at least 50,000 years. It has altered the outcomes of wars, collapsed empires, and shaped the human genome itself. The sickle cell trait, a genetic mutation that offers partial protection against Plasmodium falciparum, is present in hundreds of millions of people today because the populations that lacked it were, across countless generations, less likely to survive long enough to reproduce. Malaria did not just kill people, it rewrote human DNA. In 2022, the World Health Organization recorded 247 million malaria cases and 619,000 deaths. 77% of those deaths were children under the age of 5. A child in sub-Saharan Africa dies of malaria approximately every 2 minutes. Malaria is caused by Plasmodium parasites, primarily Plasmodium falciparum and Plasmodium vivax, transmitted through the bites of infected female Anopheles mosquitoes. Once inside the human body, the parasite travels to the liver, matures, and then floods the bloodstream, invading and destroying red blood cells in cycles that produce the characteristic waves of fever, chills, and sweating. Plasmodium falciparum, the most lethal species, can cause cerebral malaria in which infected red blood cells block the tiny vessels supplying the brain, leading to coma, seizures, and death within hours. Children whose immune systems have not had time to develop any partial resistance are the most vulnerable, and they die at a rate the statistics can describe, but the mind resists accepting. Sub-Saharan Africa carries 95% of the global malaria burden. In 2021, the World Health Organization approved the first malaria vaccine RTS-S, marketed as Mosquirix, after decades of development. It offers approximately 30 to 40% protection against clinical malaria in young children, far below the threshold required for meaningful population-level impact. A second vaccine, R21 Matrix M, developed through a partnership between the University of Oxford and the Serum Institute of India, demonstrated 77% efficacy in trials published in The Lancet in 2023, the most promising result in the history of malaria vaccine research. Rollout is in its infancy. Meanwhile, Plasmodium falciparum has been developing resistance to artemisinin, the backbone of frontline combination therapy and the last widely effective treatment available to the communities that need it most. Artemisinin resistance was first confirmed in Southeast Asia and, as of research published in 2023, has now been documented on the African continent itself. Climate change is expanding the territory, rising temperatures and shifting rainfall patterns are extending the range of Anopheles mosquitoes into highland areas of East Africa and Latin America that were previously too cool to support year-round transmission. Populations in these newly affected areas carry no accumulated immunity. The disease arriving in a highland Kenyan community that has never experienced it before lands with the same force as it landed on populations encountering it for the first time thousands of years ago. We have antiviral treatments that fail. We have a vaccine that partially works. We have a parasite that is mutating around our drugs, a mosquito vector that is expanding its range as the planet warms, and a death toll of 619,000 in a single year, the vast majority of them children, in a disease we have been trying to defeat for the entirety of recorded human history. Every other disease on this list represents a horror that medicine is, however slowly and imperfectly, containing. Malaria is different. Malaria has been here longer than civilization. It has written itself into our bodies, and as the world warms and our treatments falter, it is not retreating. The medieval world feared the plague. They were right to. But the oldest, most patient, and most relentless killer they lived alongside was never the one that announced itself with blackened lymph nodes and a death count visible from the road. It was the one that came with every summer rain that took the children first, and that is still taking them now. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.